Welcome into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donohue. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see a couple friends on board with us on a Monday morning to break things down. Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen, both of whom were out in Ann Arbor for the matchup at Michigan Stadium, which went awry early and certainly got worse as things carried on Saturday afternoon. We had our post-game podcast up on Saturday evening. Daniel joined me from Michigan Stadium. We spent about 45 minutes or so with immediate reactions, talking about some of the topics out of this. We have a little bit of time to digest before we show up for these Monday shows. So we have some more analysis to provide from that last matchup. And we'll talk big picture because Penn State enters a week they cannot afford to squander. And Mark Brennan will bring you in. You've traveled. You've made this trip a bunch of times to see Penn State play in the big house. It's been a bit of a house of horrors when it has been full for James Franklin making that trip. And they added to that this past Saturday in a very emphatic way. Just curious to hear your initial reaction. I read your top takeaways. I read your report card. I think I have a pretty good indication of where your head's at. But how stunned were you that Penn State showed up in this way and got sent home in this kind of a fashion?
Yeah, and you know what made it even crazier, Tyler, was the fact that through some miracle, Penn State was in this game, late in the second quarter and even into the third quarter. I mean, Penn State played very poorly. And thanks to a lucky bounce of a football off of PJ Mustipher and a Sean Clifford run, they end up right in that ball game. And somehow you think a lot of times when you see those types of games, teams are able to capitalize on that good fortune. And clearly Penn State was not. And the weird thing about it is, Daniel, and you were out there. That's a good atmosphere, but it's not as crazy as like an Ohio State can be, or a Wisconsin, or an Iowa. But for some reason, under James Franklin, Penn State's just not been able to perform well out there. Not only are they losing, they're getting their heads handed to them. And going into that game, we all three of us picked Penn State to lose that game, but all three of us envisioned it as a tight game. And I am just surprised that Penn State was manhandled the way it was. And one of the things that I don't want to say that I liked it, but it's one thing for us to say that Penn State was embarrassed. It's a completely different thing for the players to say it. Listen, people, we like to think we know what we're talking about, but, sometimes maybe we go overboard. But when PJ Mustipher, a team leader, is coming in that media room afterward and saying he was embarrassed by the performance, that's telling you all you need to know. I mean, that wasn't a good enough effort by the coaching staff. It wasn't a good enough effort by the offense, the defense. Barney and Moore played kind of well. But beyond that, that was coming off of a 5-0 start. That was much worse to me than what they did at Iowa last year. Because at Iowa last year, at least you could blame it on Clifford being hurt. You could blame it on PJ Mustipher being hurt. This, they just got their heads handed to them. And that's a bad sign. That's a bad sign headed into the second half of the season.
I think the more appropriate game to measure it up against, although a very different opponent, might be the Illinois matchup and the way they showed up for that game in Beaver Stadium out of a bye week. And Daniel, we've got a big week ahead. We don't get a chance to speak with players or coaches until Tuesday. And when we start to do that, we'll have our coverage at Lions247. But I imagine there's going to be a lot of statements that echo PJ Mustipher's sentiments. And I read your story coming out of Saturday night into Sunday morning, Daniel, about that embarrassing aspect of it, where they didn't just lose this game, but they got sent home kind of with their tail tucked between their legs with the way this one turned out. Jair Brown told you it was a wake-up call for this defense. When you hear some of these leaders say what they're saying after the game, how key are the next 48 hours, in your opinion, before Penn State logs that first physical practice session of the week?
Definitely. I think a lot of what we heard from those veteran leaders was pretty telling in terms of how they approached, their thoughts on the game. I mean, obviously, PJ Mustipher saying that it was embarrassing. That's a strong statement. And there wasn't really any sugarcoating of anything. It didn't feel like there was attempts to spin things, because I think they knew that everybody knows that game was not close at all. And I think that we saw some kind of genuine emotion and genuine thoughts on what's next. With Mustipher, I also thought that when he said that he's going to need to sit with this one overnight. He still said that, we come in on Sunday and that's when we get to work for next week and we move on. But there wasn't kind of that immediate, okay, we're just going to flush this one and move on. That I think you hear sometimes after these kinds of losses where it's like, yeah, we just need to put this behind us. We need to move on. But I think the fact that PJ said that he's going to sit with it overnight, the fact that Jair Brown did call it a wake-up call. I forget which defensive player it was, but we got we need to look in the mirror quote, which is always that always raises my eyebrows a little bit, because we thought we knew what this team was and we thought they knew what they were. I think that Sunday into Monday and then into Tuesday when they get back to work, I think that's really crucial for this team. And I think that they're going into a spot on Saturday where it's the whiteout, but with Minnesota coming in off a loss, there's not quite as much juice behind this game, I think. And so I think this response is going to be really telling about what kind of team Penn State has this year.
And guys, I think you didn't really have to look beyond the face of the franchise and James Franklin, the guy who has the keys to this whole thing, during his post-game press conference. And Daniel described him as kind of having that defeated demeanor, not just taking the loss in that column, but just really feeling down about how his program performed, clearly coming out of a bye, acknowledging during that last week that they had changed some things up in their bye week approach. They understood the struggles that had existed in the past under this current regime. And then to come out and have an absolute thud like this, Mark, those bye week questions aren't going to stop now just because the bye week's past us. It's something that James Franklin's going to have to answer this week. And it's certainly something that come next week, whatever that 2023 schedule looks like, whoever they have coming out of the bye, it may be my alma mater, it may be USC. We don't know what it's going to be. But next week this is going to be next year this is going to be hanging over James Franklin, and it's starting to stack up with that record against Michigan and the record against Ohio State that people do it. There's something to be said about coming out of the bye week and having those 2 weeks, and what we heard about their preparation didn't indicate anything like this was going to happen. And so, Mark, you've seen a lot of James Franklin's post gamers. You've seen him in some emotional situations after losses. What did you make of his demeanor and kind of the message he sent? Because he was all over the place a little bit, talking about needing to recruit bigger guys, saying they have players who think they're Aaron Donald, but they're not. It was really far-ranging for the moment.
Yeah, I would respectfully say that after some of these losses that he needs to just dial it back a little bit. There's no reason to be going into the whole Aaron Donald, your defensive linemen are too small. I mean, where did that come from? And while it may be true, I think that's something that's probably better stated on a Tuesday, that, if you're thinking there's some overarching problem that, we heard zero about for
nothing all year.
Nothing. And but I think he's I don't want to be critical of a coach who's speaking from his heart, because that's what he was doing. But by the same token, I think it would serve him better to wait to discuss that sort of stuff until Tuesday. If he thinks that is a major issue, I think you take a deep breath and then you address that situation Tuesday. Because, we were walking out of the stadium. Daniel and I stayed in different places. So I was walking out with some other reporters. And it's like, well, who do you think he was talking about? And somebody said they thought they were talking about Mustapher. I said, what are you talking about? He's not talking about Mustapher. He's like the biggest guy. He's talking about guys like Akeem Beeman and Zane Durant, who we've barely seen, who we heard so much about. So when you're talking, but I just don't know that I looked at that game and thought, oh my God, they're not big enough on the defensive line. That's why they lost that game. I wasn't quite following that train of thought. And that's why I say that respectfully, because I think James Franklin's usually terrific in the post game. And again, I don't want to be critical of somebody being honest, because how often are we critical of coaches or players for not being honest in those situations? But I just don't know that that's a subject that needs to be broached. But getting to your point, Tyler, I think that speaks to how much that loss hurt him. I mean, listen, we looked at this game coming in. It was going to be a defining game for both of these programs, for one of these programs, not for both. It wasn't going to be a defining game for both of them. But for Michigan, can they validate what they did last year, or was that a one-off? And for Penn State, can you get this, albatross, out of your program that you can't win against top 10 programs, and you struggle against Michigan and Ohio State? especially Michigan. Well, not especially Michigan, but both teams. But, your one win at Michigan was in a COVID year when it was, 4 of us in the press box, and that was about it. So, yeah, I mean, I think he was genuinely hurt after that game and disappointed. And I'm sure he was embarrassed by that on a big stage on a Fox noon game. But I would say, again, respectfully, I think in that sort of situation, I think it would make a lot more sense for him not to take an overarching big picture view. I mean, we've seen this in the past after tough losses when he's come out and made these statements that, we're not elite. I mean, these are things that I think are better off discussed during the week.
I do wonder if he wishes he could walk back the "we need to recruit better" comments, because I think comments like that after your first brush with adversity as a program, I know he says he goes into the locker room afterwards and his message is more "I love you" than "let's break down what we did wrong." But when you come and speak to the media and say we got to recruit better than what we're recruiting on the roster with the team that we're playing with right now, that people can read that in different ways. Parents of players can read that in different ways. And I just don't know if that's something that he necessarily would have loved to have thrown out there in Ann Arbor if he could have a do-over there. But we'll hear from him on Tuesday afternoon. There's going to be tough questions. There's going to be tougher questions than he's really had to encounter through a 5-0 start. That's the way the college football works. That's the way the sports works. When you had that defeat, people want to point to the blemishes a little bit more. So where do we want to point? We got a defense that gave up 400-plus rushing yards, and then we have an offense that continued to sputter out of the gates in the bye week and has really not gone in the right direction here in the past month. So let's go offense first, because, Mark, we spent a lot of time toward the tail end of the podcast discussing the quarterback of this offensive attack. But I want to start with the offensive coordinator, because before we get to Sean Clifford, who's been around here for a while, has worked with several offensive coordinators, much of the talk has been, you've got Mike Yurcich in place. You guys are joined at the hip here. You're back for year 6. He's back for year 2. And you'd think coming out of the bye, this is the perfect scenario to flex those kind of muscles that you've been in the lab per se, and you have everything ironed out here. Because we said it going into the game, you didn't need Sean Clifford to go out and throw for 400 yards and 5 touchdowns, just like Michigan ultimately didn't need that kind of an effort from J.J. McCarthy. But we thought with the supporting pieces, with the potential balance that might have on offense, fast forward to where we are now, running backs got 13 carries. Sean Clifford completed a career worst 38% of his passes over the course of this game. And now in 39 career starts, Mark, 8 times Sean Clifford has completed 50% or fewer of his throws in a matchup. That includes the last 2 Big Ten contests. But before we get to 14, I want to hear what you, Mark Brennan, had to say about this offensive coordinator and the plan that Penn State's going to carry out for the next 6 weeks. Because to me, Mike Yurcich, this is where it starts to be. What are you all about? That we had this last year. What are you going to show us when it matters most? And it was really, really underwhelming what they produced out of Michigan.
Yeah, 2 things. Number one, what you touched on. Was there any indication whatsoever? I mean, any indication that Penn State was coming into that game off of a bye? Did we see anything unique? Did we, if anything, it looked like Michigan was a team coming off the bye. I still scratch my head over that. And that's on both sides of the ball, but especially on offense. I mean, did we see anything? And then, again, through some miracle of the football gods, you are in that game at halftime. Did we see any adjustments? Anything? I mean, it's again, you're looking at this game in where are the adjustments within the season? I mean, you have this bye that wasn't strategically placed, but from a strategic standpoint, it was at the perfect spot because you're able to go through those first 5 games, and then you're coming into what we were over and over calling a gauntlet. And sure enough, it is a gauntlet, right? I mean, it's a gauntlet. Didn't see anything. I mean, there was no indication. And so I'm still confused by that. And again, getting into the second half of that game, it's like, where are the adjustments? I would like to say one thing about Clifford. Okay, listen. They had a lot of strong leaders come out after the game and talk. Unfortunately, he was banged up and he couldn't do it. I always respect him for coming out and being a very good spokesman for the team. But for anybody who didn't see Sean Clifford quotes after the game, it was because he was hurt. So do not be critical of him for that. But what I would be, I mean, Tyler, you touched on this. I mean, and I have the numbers here. Going into that Northwestern game, his efficiency 148.9, his completion percentage 64.1, his yards per game 225.5. All of those numbers are down. So now his completion percentage for the season, 59%, is below his career completion percentage. His yards per game, 199.1 or 191.7 this season, are below his career averages. And his efficiency has dropped over 10 points. I mean, these are, so you're in the Big Ten and you get into your biggest games and your quarterback isn't getting the job done. He's just not. I mean, and that, so you combine that with your offensive coordinator struggling and your quarterback struggling. And I think those are the two key issues with the offense. I don't think the offensive line was the issue in this game. I mean, yeah, it didn't do a great job of opening up holes, but it did a pretty good job of protecting Clifford. And overall, I thought the receivers played well. There were a drop here and there. And, you know, the running backs, I give them the offensive line, like I said, did struggle a little bit opening holes. So that was made it tough for but there were opportunities there. If you had a quarterback who was remotely efficient, that I think they could have taken advantage of, and they did.
They did not get the ball to Mitchell Tinsley, Brenton Strange, or Katron Allen before Michigan had 3 scoring drives already in the books. They did not get a first down on a passing play until the third quarter. They only completed balls to 3 different receivers. Mitchell Tinsley had 5 catches. Parker Washington had 3 catches. And Harrison Wallace had 2 catches. And then Brenton Strange led the tight end room with 1 catch for 9 yards. That's all you got out of the tight end group.
And how many targets? How many targets, Tyler?
Nothing. I mean,
Strange was targeted 3 times. So this is what, in the last 2 games, he's been targeted 4 or 5 times. I mean, and in this game, Tinsley was targeted 9. So you have a guy who's playing like an All-American, and you're not getting the rock.
Meanwhile, Nick Singleton, Katron Allen both got 6 carries. That is the lowest total of their career. So again, the ball wasn't in the hands of your playmakers here. Most of the times on offense, they were barely out on the field. Going through the drive comparison chart here, as Michigan was decimating this defense in their first 3 drives, were going for 517, 610, and 620 in terms of time of possession. Penn State's opening drives here, 3 plays for 2 minutes and 8 seconds, 3 plays for 1 minute and 31 seconds. They had a 7-play drive in 2 minutes and 18 seconds. They got the touchdown because Sean Clifford picked up 62 of those yards on a 3rd and short run. But it's just more of the same in the second half. 1 minute and 30 to pick up a field goal, a turnover on downs in 3.5 minutes, which was their longest series of the day. And then Sean Clifford's last possession was a 150 possession. So you're not doing your defense any favors in those situations. And my question is, a lot of the argument to be made, Daniel, for Sean Clifford to start in a game like this, to have the leeway to remain in a game like this for as long as it's competitive, is because you're in Ann Arbor and Sean Clifford has played everywhere and he's seen everything that the Big Ten can throw your way. Have we seen everything that Sean Clifford can throw the Big Ten's way?
It feels like we have almost at this point. I think that, like you said, this is the type of game where your 6-year quarterback is supposed to make a difference, whether that is physically or intangibly. You're supposed to get a boost there from that experience, and we just didn't see that on Saturday. I mean, you can make the case that, well, he didn't get many opportunities to show it because the offense was just on and off the field so quickly, but that's also partly his fault. I think going back to the point about this team coming off the bye, it just felt like there were no wrinkles in this offense. There was nothing that we hadn't seen before. So I assume that Michigan had seen pretty much everything that Penn State was there. And I think that after the Northwestern game, I think Mark was kind of sounding the alarm a little bit about the tight end usage. And the fact that, we've heard so much about this room. Brenton Strange is playing so well. You need to get them the ball more. I think I kind of downplayed that coming out of Northwestern, but I think that you look at Big Ten football, you need those big guys. You need to just take yards where you can get them. And I think that Brenton Strange has shown the ability to get yards when you need them, to get some tough yards. And obviously, he's averaging insane. He was averaging 15 yards a catch. Obviously, that's not necessarily his style on a game in, game out basis, but He's someone that can get the ball in his hands, make a couple guys miss, jump over someone. He's a playmaker that needs to be more involved. Theo Johnson has been pretty much invisible this year. We haven't even seen Tyler Warren in that quarterback role in a short yardage situation. So I think you look up and down the roster on the offensive side of the ball, and like the offensive line, I didn't come away from that game really feeling like they played poorly. You kind of, the thought with Nick Singleton, with Kaytron Allen, is that, okay, these are the types of running backs, these are the types of talents where if something isn't quite 100% correct on that offensive line, which it wasn't going to be against Michigan's front, that these are the types of players that can make someone miss, that can make something happen, make something out of nothing. And they just didn't make that happen on Saturday. So, and I think it all goes back to Clifford. It all goes back to Mike Yurcich. The returns right now are not good, especially over the past 2 weeks. So yeah, I mean, it just feels like we've seen kind of what we're going to see from Clifford. Maybe he has an Auburn type performance from last year when he was 28 of 32, super efficient. Maybe he has one of those games still in him, but I think that when you look overall, he has more games like Saturday, more games like Central Michigan. That's more who he is than, either Auburn game or even who he was late in that Purdue game.
So we've got inconsistent quarterback play that we're questioning now in a crucial point in the season. We've got the running back usage all of a sudden plummeting, and we've got the tight end room disappearing. Guys, stop me if you've heard this before. It feels a lot like the deja vu of what we were discussing as October turned to November last year. The one separating factor here, of course, is that you do have the Drew Allar part of the equation, which was not present last October, last November. And this week, with our old buddy Kirk Shiraka coming back to town, we don't know if he'll have Tanner Morgan. I don't know what the latest is there. It didn't look positive in terms of him leaving that last Minnesota matchup. But Kirk Shiraka was here in 2020. We know what happened. Franklin says, thanks for your services. It was great having you around for a pandemic. Good luck elsewhere. Here's Mike Yurcich brought on board. And now here we are. And the sample size is 19 games of Mike Yurcich as the offensive coordinator for Penn State. It's not some shiny new imaginative aspect of this program. It's very tangible. There's a lot of proof to point to. And the question now becomes, the one quarterback in this room who was personally recruited to Penn State by Mike Yurcich, and the guy that everyone in this building knows was the number one quarterback for a reason, at least in our rankings at 247 Sports. Is this the week that you either make a move outright, and you can potentially pin that to Sean Clifford's health status, because James Franklin was very succinct in why he made the move in the fourth quarter last week. He said Sean was hurt. That's all he gave us. So my question is, and then if we see Sean at practice on Wednesday, how imperative is it, guys, that Drew Allar is a part of the plan on offense? Not a guy who can come in when the game's decided, not a guy who can sneak in for a series, but a guy that you are legitimately taking a long look at to find out if he can accelerate your offensive growth and expand your offensive capabilities in the next 5-6 games of this season.
Well, if you're not going to do it in this game, when are you going to do it? Right? Are you going to wait till Ohio State? I mean, that would be nuts, wouldn't it? I mean, if you're going to do it, you got to do it now, I think. I mean, you either start the guy or you give him a bunch of snaps. I mean, I said it last week. You looked at what was happening with Clifford. He was going back to the mean. He was going back to what he's always been. And listen, he's one of the toughest quarterbacks, if not the toughest quarterback I've ever seen. He's been a great leader. He's been a great mentor to these younger QBs. But as you look at this season and where this game is, if they lose this game, forget it, man. I mean, this thing is coming unwound. So you are either making the decision now or you're not. I mean, I don't know what sense would it make if you go with Clifford in this game. And if they decide to do that, fine. But then you're going with Clifford. That's the way you're going. But if you're going to make the move to Allar, you either start him or you play him a bunch in this game, because you can't do it the following week, can you? I mean, you can't send him out there as the starter against Ohio State. I mean, I guess you could.
It would be poetic considering he was Mr. Football in Ohio last year. But yeah, I mean, that would be quite the move.
I just don't think it would make sense.
I just think if you don't have the motivation and wherewithal to make the move this week, are you going to find that next week? That's the question. If you can't find it as a staff to say we're making this move or we're getting Drew a ton of work in this game, if you can't make that call this week, coming out of the game that you just had, coming out of the couple game stretch you've just had, knowing that this is start 40 for Sean Clifford, he's thrown the third most amount of passes in Penn State history. Do you really think that his ceiling is suddenly going to raise enough in the next second half of this season to put you where you want to be? Because it's still, you still don't have to watch this play out like it did last year. I'm not saying they win 7 games, but you don't have to watch it turn into a 3-game losing streak or turn into a second half of spiraling. And you can take that chance with Drew Allar. He's thrown 14 passes in his career against Big Ten programs. And what you're weighing with him is if the immediate concerns about him as a rookie outweigh the immediate potential that he would provide as a top-level prospect. And Daniel, you're paying your offensive coordinator a lot of money. You made a shrewd move to get him on campus. He went to work, got Drew Allar. Here you are at a crossroads. The Sean Clifford conundrum hasn't worked itself out through half a season. This is why you make a ton of money. This is why you're a CEO of a high-level football program. I'm not saying that they need to make this change right now, but if they are not going into the workplace on a Sunday and a Monday and seriously chewing about this decision and about making some kind of a quarterback move, whether it's for half a game or a full game, I don't think they're doing their due diligence to themselves, to the members of this roster, and to the fan base, quite frankly.
Everything has to be on the table right now, up and down the roster, and especially at quarterback, because, if not now, like you guys said, when are you going to do it? You can't afford to drop all 3 of these games if you want to be, in the mix or just kind of hovering around contention, in case some weird stuff happens elsewhere in the Big Ten, in the country. You just can't do that because you look at November, obviously, it's not exactly a murderer's row there after this, but all those teams are pesky. All those teams can, weird things can happen. You just look at what happened last year with the loss to Illinois. So I think they just have to put everything on the table. They have to look at all of the possibilities. I think we've graduated past the fact that, okay, we need to get Allar that just a series in the second quarter. I think that if you play him, you need to have him out there for multiple series in the first half. If you do decide to play him early and do some kind of 2 quarterback system, I think that you just have to do something that'll raise the ceiling of the offense because, Mark said Sean Clifford has gone back to the mean. I mean, he's gone past the mean at this point. He is, you talk about breaking his ceiling. I mean, he's crashing through the floor right now with how he's played over the past 2 games. And I think that those stats that Mark put out about how far all those numbers have dropped in these past 2 weeks, I mean, that's pretty alarming when you talk about getting production from the most important position on the field. So I think that Clifford has helped. And I think the ceiling of this offense is very far down right now. And I think that Allar is someone who can help raise that ceiling a little bit. I think that in comparing it to last year you had Jahan Dotson as the guy who was able to bail out this offense, to be there for Clifford, to make things happen. No one has really shown they can be that on offense this year. So and since you don't have that one individual talent, you need to look at kind of the whole package, that whole unit, and figure out, okay, what are changing quarterbacks isn't exactly a small tweak, but what are kind of the moves that you can make to put guys in the best position to raise the ceiling, to be in a spot where you can score, you need to score 24 points, you need to score 28 points. You need to put together, a drive that takes 5 minutes. Who can do that on the roster? And I think everything just needs to be on the table this week because season can get away from you in a hurry. And you don't want to be in a position like you were last year where you got to November and you looked at what had happened elsewhere in the conference. You looked at what happened in October, and it was just kind of a very bleak picture for those last couple of weeks.
You talk about raising the ceiling of the offense as a whole, not just the quarterback position. We're at the halfway point of this season right now, and your leading receivers, Parker Washington, Mitchell Tinsley, are at 23 and 24 catches. They're the only players at this point who are averaging 3 catches or more on the season per game. And we still haven't seen Parker Washington reach the end zone halfway through this season. And when you look at the running back production, we got really excited about it, of course, in September, but now we've got it 3 games against non-conference opponents, 3 games against Big Ten teams. I talked about Katron Allen, 6 carries for 16 yards. He had a touchdown. Nick Singleton, 19 yards on 6 carries. By the way, Singleton had 3 touches in the first quarter. We didn't see him again until the third quarter. Part of that was the way the game dictated. But again, if you want to get the ball in the hands of these guys who can be difference makers, that wasn't happening with enough frequency, I thought, to give yourself a shot. When a guy can go 80 on any play, try to get him the football. 3 Big Ten opponents, they are 3.8 combined on their average on 72 carries against 3 non-conference opponents in September. Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, they averaged about 9 yards per carry on 60 carries. So they got some stuff to figure out for these guys. They're trying to break through to the next level, and they got to do it against some Big Ten opponents here. A lot to work through on offense. By the way, I don't think we mentioned this in the postgame podcast. No Landon Tengwall on the field, starting left guard for the first 5 games. According to James Franklin, he was injured in some way during pregame warmups. That meant a lot of Hunter Norzad, who was back involved for the first time in a month. I'm not sure if he was fully healthy quite yet, but he was out there at left guard. We saw some Bryce Effner at left guard, and of course at right tackle as well. Let's switch over and finish it out with some defensive thoughts because, look, Manny Diaz was riding a high. I think a lot of people were ready to buy into what he was selling. The takeaways were piling up. We've seen the pieces come together for this Penn State offense, and then we saw the puzzle fall apart. And now the question becomes, can they put it back together? Because I think they're going to get a very motivated Kirk Shiraka coming to town this Saturday. And, of course, we know what Ohio State brings to the table offensively the following week. Mark, honeymoon period is over for Manny Diaz. And I'll tell you what, it feels a lot like we discussed coming out of the Illinois game last year when they gave up 350-plus rushing yards. The problem here is they're much deeper than they were last year in the defensive line, and they weren't missing P.J. Mustipher. So you go all across the defensive front, include the linebackers in this conversation. This is gut check time, just like we talked about on the offense this upcoming week.
Yeah, Manny picked the best time to do his conference call with reporters because he got it out of the way before. And if I just can't imagine if Yursich ends up being a dude this week, it's going to be that could be interesting. But listen, you look at their first 5 opponents and what did they have in common? They were all one-dimensional. I mean, the only team that had a remotely good running game was Auburn, and their quarterbacks were so bad that you could really focus in on one area. And I will tell you, the player that I was most impressed with on Saturday was J.J. McCarthy. And I give Harbaugh a lot of credit because he puts the kid in positions to succeed. But the kid makes the most of those opportunities. He is ridiculously accurate. It's like night and day from watching a Penn State offense. And so while we're focusing on rushing for 418 yards or whatever it was, I thought what allowed them to rush for all those yards was how McCarthy just killed them every time he passed. It was I mean, outside of obviously the pick 6, which was kind of a fluke play. And that was the issue. And where did he really beat them up? Not with the long passes. I mean, I forget what the number was. I don't have it right here in front of me. It was something like 18 of 20. He only missed 2 completions, I think, on passes of 14 yards or shorter. And who is that exploiting? Right? The linebackers. I mean, what were we talking about all season long? The group that we had to keep an eye on. And they played well through 5 games. And then you get to a team that's multidimensional, and they really struggled. And it's not all on the linebackers. I mean, the defensive line wasn't any good either. I mean, none of their better players played well up front. I don't think this was on the secondary. I think the secondary was so beat up by having to make all those tackles. It was ridiculous. But, the one stat I had, I think Tyler Elsdon had the most tackles of any linebacker with 5. And 4 of them were assists. He had 1 solo tackle. Your top tackling linebacker has 1 solo tackle in a game where the team has over 90 tackles. I mean, so yeah, we talked about red flags coming out of Northwestern with the offense. Well, now your red flag is what? The linebacker situation. And I think they have to find a way to get Abdul Carter out there. I'm not saying he played a great game, but I think when you look at upsides of players, that guy needs to be out there as much as possible And you need to find more ways to play him with Curtis Jacobs. I don't know how you go about that, who you put where. But I think that linebacker situation really has to be figured out because, before this week, Minnesota was the top rushing team in the Big Ten. Obviously, Michigan took that over by plotting Penn State. And Ohio State is in the top 3 in rushing in the Big Ten. So all of those teams are great rushing teams. So you better get that figured out quickly.
Yeah, Mohamed Ibrahim, all he's done as Minnesota's running back this year is go for 100+ in every single game that he has played in. So that's what's coming.
And if the quarterback's hurt, Tyler, what's going to happen? If Tanner Morgan's hurt, what are they going to do?
You'd think they load it up and try to punch them in the mouth repeatedly early and see if Penn State's ready to withstand it after getting knocked on the tarp repeatedly at Michigan. And I think when you view this defense and what happened, 11 of 17 on third downs, Michigan was able to do. They didn't just average almost 8 yards per rush. They averaged more than 7 yards per play, period. Of course, the stat that everyone was focused on after the game, Michigan never punted. They had the ball for 42 minutes. There is just a lot to answer for here for Penn State. Again, coming out of a bye week. That's what looms over this. That's what augments, and that's what really creates a lot of just really frustration with people.
Can I tell a quick joke? And I have to give this
Sure.
say this to Neil Rudell, because we drove out together and we drove back together. And we were talking about something. It's like, what did they work on during the bye week? And Neil said, well, I bet you they had a great punt block set up. You get it? Because Michigan didn't punt. I mean, I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah.
Maybe I didn't deliver it as well as it needed to be delivered, but they had that in their back pocket. They just didn't get to use it. Sorry.
Neil's always got them. And by the way, when we look toward this team, it wasn't a great day for special teams. I don't want to give them a free pass either. Stacey Collins is now halfway through his first season as special teams coordinator. We saw a ball go out of bounds on a kickoff. Penn State couldn't afford to make any mistakes on this Saturday. Gabe Nwasu was out there, and we saw a bobble on a return. It wasn't a good day all around. You can point to all 3 coordinators. You can point to the head coach. There's a lot of money invested in all of those positions within your program, and you want the return on investment, especially when you got that extra week to prepare, especially when you're in a national showcase game. And Penn State fell flat on its face in this matchup in a way that none of us anticipated. So we will be back on Tuesday. We will be fresh out of James Franklin's first press conference coming out of this game. So it's probably a conversation you won't want to miss. We'll give you some updates on players, on personnel, and what we're hearing about preparation for Minnesota, but more importantly on how Penn State is going to try to shake this off of them. About 48 hours removed from that kickoff here as we speak on a Monday. We'll talk to you guys real soon. Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen did a fantastic job with coverage out at Michigan Stadium. Hopefully you'll check out all the stuff they continue to produce at Lions247.com. We've got our snap counts breakdown from the matchup, position by position look on why that matters and what those totals show us. And additionally, Tyler Calvaruzzo, he's in for a busy week. We got a huge whiteout recruiting event to look forward to on Saturday. He's already got a full, complete early look at that list up on our site at Lions247.com. Go check that stuff out. A big thanks to our producer, Lance Glynn. For now, I'm Tyler Donohue, stepping away. This has been the Lions247 Podcast.